Okay, welcome back to part 6, and we are looking at um, we're still looking at the chain of custody, how these witness statements got to into either Mormonism Unveiled, which was finally published in November of 1834, and we looked at Holbert's statement, we looked at Edie Howe's statement, we looked at Aaron Wright's draft letter that was dictated by Holbert. Now we want to look at what about these other witnesses that were taken down in 1839 and beyond that for at least the next 50 years or so. So, what we would need to understand is, in regards to this, is that we need to understand that, you know, unless something is contrary to the case, that, these newspaper editors, they actually took down these statements and written them down genuinely and it stands on its own merit, right? I mean, we would see, I think, that if it was a forgery, that these witnesses would have come forward and would have written down and said, "No, that's not what I said. He didn't write down the information accurately." And what's interesting is nobody ever did that. That's kind of interesting. So I don't think we have any reason to cast doubt on the genuineness of these statements. Okay. So we kind of already answered this question, but we want to go into just a little bit deeper. Okay. So was D.P. Holbert, was he the originator of the Spalding theory? Since he took down the affidavits, as we talked about with Benjamin Winchester and what he asserted. And let's dive into a little bit of history. So here's what um, the YouTube channel Saints Unscripted writes about. They say in the 34 second mark to 1 minute 18-second mark, the first person to propose a Spalding-Rigdon theory was a guy named Philatus Holbert. Soon after, he had been excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In fact, he was excommunicated from 3 different churches that we know of, all for issues dealing with immorality. But anyway, after he was excommunicated from our faith, he dedicated himself to destroying Joseph Smith's name and character. In his travels, he obtained several affidavits smearing Joseph's name. Some of them come from neighbors and family of a man named Solomon Spalding, a former preacher and unpublished author who died in 1816. So the question is he the first person to propose the Spalding-Rigdon theory? Well, what's interesting is what we find is 2 groups of people. One group will say the Book of Mormon is connected to Solomon Spalding. Another set of people are going to say the Book of Mormon is connected to Sidney Rigdon, but they don't cross each other. That's what's interesting. And so let me show that to you. So you'll remember our timeline here. And let's just revisit it again. So 1816, Spalding dies. 1830, Book of Mormon is published. And then there's missionary activity being done throughout the region. And two LDS missionaries, Orson Hyde, Samuel Smith. Now, I want you to notice this is 1832, 1 year before D.P. Holbert. Okay? So, in the diary written by Hyde, he says this February 9th. Went back into the village, preached in the evening to a large congregation, warned them faithfully of the evils, spent the night again with Mr. Holcomb. The 10th. Left Mr. Holcomb's and went down to Kingsville, 6 miles, held a meeting at Mr. Woodbury's. Small congregation, but gave good attention, something excited. 11th. Left Mr. Woodbury's house, went on to Salem, which is Conneaut. Found some friendly and some enemies. Some, I think, will go to Zion. So we ran into Zion. We ran into Hyde, and we saw that Hyde was one of the this not the last video, but the previous video. We saw that he was Holbert's partner. Remember, for missionary work, and he's the one that made charges against Holbert. All right, the 12th. Sunday morning, went on near Salem Village. To a Christian congregation, attended a meeting with them, heard them exhort, pray, etc. At the close of the meeting, arose and told them our mission and desired permission to preach in the evening. And after a little conversation among them, they unanimously agreed we should preach. Attended a crowded and attentive audience. They requested we should tarry and preach again. Accordingly, made an appointment for next evening, tarried all night with a Mr. Sawtrell, kindly entertained. 13. Visited 2 or 3 families in the vicinity of Salem. Held a meeting in the evening, a large and attentive congregation. Some appear to be excited. So 2 Book of Mormons, tarried all night with Colonel Fifield. So it's interesting what he says there. So if you remember, he says he went to Kingsville on February 10, 1832. Okay? Then we see on the 11th, he goes into the vicinity of Salem, which is Conneaut, Ohio. And then on the 12th, Sunday morning, went on near Salem Village to a Christian congregation. And so the question is, why did some in Salem or Conneaut get excited? Remember that Spalding once lived here. Remember that Spalding frequently read his material to them, or some of them did read his material. So some friends, some acquaintances, some neighbors who knew Spalding had attended the meeting held by the LDS missionaries. And one, we know, was Aaron Wright, as he discussed in his draft letter, one of the Conneaut witnesses. Remember, we saw this, and we already read this part, so I'm not going to give this again. This is in our last video. But we see that after Hulbert had obtained the first manuscript, he came back to Conneaut, and he visited with Aaron Wright and dictated the letter that Aaron Wright wanted him to write down. So this unsigned letter belongs to Aaron Wright. Draft personally dictated by Wright to Hulbert. The time frame Hulbert returned to Wright to obtain another personal witness testimony on December 31st, 1833. Hulbert left the unsigned draft copy with Wright, who left it in an account book and eventually came into the hands of Hiram Lake's widow. Hulbert also obtained affidavits, but did not survive, probably burned in the fire at the newspaper office. That manuscript story was not the same story from Oliver Smith, John Miller, and others. And we see the evidence here is that when the first manuscript was discovered in 1884 in Honolulu, Hawaii, it had a statement written on the back that said, "The writings of Solomon Spalding proved by Aaron Wright, Oliver Smith, John Miller, and others. The testimony of the above gentlemen are now in my possession. D.P. Hulbert." And that's it, the signature there. That's the writing there. Now, Wright and others tell Hulbert that Spalding informed him that the unfinished Roman story, manuscript story, the one that was discovered in the trunk, which we'll come across to later, had been written by him for his own amusement. He switched gears, began writing a different story, giving the fictional history of the first settlement of America. He went farther back with dates and writing in the old scripture style in order to appear ancient, like "and it came to pass." And after obtaining the new affidavits from Conneaut, he returned to the Kirtland area. So that is really, we see the connection between Solomon Spalding and the Conneaut witnesses, which was first made by Nehemiah King, but he had died before D.P. Hulbert when he came to seek affidavits. King had actually died by that time. But King had told Aaron Wright, and maybe possibly others, saying that this is the writings of Solomon Spalding. Now, this is interesting enough. 2 years before Hulbert, what we're going to talk about next. This is what's called the Cleveland Advertiser. Notice the date, February 15th, 1831. And here's what it says. The Painesville Telegraph of this morning has the particulars of the acceptance of a challenge by Thomas Campbell given by a noted mountebank by the name of Elder Rigdon, who has flourished in and about the openings for the last few years, and to the no small wonderment of all the old women round about that country, to test the validity of the doctrine contained in the Book of Mormon. We know that Thomas Campbell did want to actually have a debate with Sidney Rigdon. It is something singular that the subject should have created such a stir. The editor of the Telegraph has opened his paper to discussion of its merits and demerits. Rigdon was formerly a disciple of Campbell's, talking about Alexander Campbell. Or he might also be talking about Thomas Campbell, but most likely Alexander Campbell. And who it's said was sent out to make proselytes, but it's probable he thought he should find it more advantageous to operate on his own capital, and therefore wrote, as is believed, the Book of Mormon, and commenced his pilgrimage in the town of Kirtland, which was represented as one of the extreme points of the Holy Land. The good people of that country were wont to take a different notice of nuances and by placing them astride a rail, accompanying with the music of kettle drums, tin pans, and pumpkin vines to the tune of Over the Hills and Far Away. Now, notice, like I said, this is a connection between Sidney Rigdon and the Book of Mormon, and I just want to show you that newspaper article there. So I find that very interesting that the connection is made between between Sidney Rigdon and the Book of Mormon. Now, a third piece of evidence is James Gordon Bennett, and it's really interesting what he wrote down in August 7th, 1831. So here's his diary entry that he wrote. Mormonism. Old Smith, Joseph Smith Sr., was a healer, a grand storyteller, very glib, was a vendor, made gingerbread and buttermints, etc., etc. Young Smith, Joseph Smith Jr., was careless, idle, indolent fellow, 22 years old, brought up to live by his wits, which means a broker of small wants. Martin Harris was a hardy, industrious farmer of Palmyra with some money, could speak off the Bible by heart. Now this is interesting. Henry, or Sidney Rigdon, a parson and general, smart fellow. He is the author of the Bible, Book of Mormon. They dig first for money. Great many Hill, Dr. Mitchell examined them, and he compared them with other hieroglyphics, thought them very curious, and they were the characters of a nation now extinct, which he named. Harris returned to Anthon, who put some questions to him and got angry with Harris. Now, unfortunately, what we don't know is where did James Gordon Bennett get the information? And unfortunately, we do not have access to who he interviewed exactly. But then he goes on to say this. I'm going down a little bit farther in his article, if you don't mind. Bennett discusses Joseph Smith and his activities, and then he reports on he misspells Rigdon. He calls him Ringdon. After the lapse of some weeks, the expedition was completed, and the famous Ohio man, which Sidney Rigdon had lived in Kirtland, Ohio, made his appearance among them. This recruit was the most cunning, intelligent, and odd of the whole. He had been a preacher of almost every religion, teacher of all sorts of morals. He was perfectly affaught with every species of prejudice, folly, or fanaticism which governs the mass of enthusiasts. In the course of his experience, he had attended all sorts of camp meetings, prayer meetings, ancient meetings, revival meetings. He knew every turn of the human mind in relation to these matters. He had a superior knowledge of human nature, considerable talent, great plausibility, knew how to work the passions as exactly as a Cape Cod sailor knew how to work a whale ship. His name, I don't know why he misspells his name this time when he had it right in his diary. His name, I believe, is Henry Ringdon or Ringdon or some such word. In the face of this hill, the money diggers renewed their work with fresh ardor. Rigdon partly uniting with them in their operations. And then he writes a sequel article, September 1st, 1831. Notice there's no connections made to Solomon Spaulding, but there are connections made to Sidney Rigdon. It was during this state of public feelings in which the money diggers of Ontario County, by the suggestions of the ex-preacher from Ohio, though of turning their digging concern into a religious plot. So most likely what happened was somehow there was Joseph Smith Jr. and I believe, as the Spaulding Enigma authors talk about, it was probably Oliver Cowdery that was the middleman between Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith Jr. And Oliver Cowdery was able to introduce Sidney Rigdon to Joseph Smith. But anyways, where was I? Money and a good living might be got in this way. It was given out that visions had appeared but to Joseph Smith, that a set of golden plates on which was engraved the Book of Mormon, enclosed in an iron chest, was deposited somewhere in the hill I have mentioned. People laughed at the first intimation of the story, but the Smiths and Langdon persisted in its truth. They began also to talk very seriously, to quote scripture, to read the Bible, to be contemplative, and to assume the grave studied character which so easily imposes on ignorant and superstitious people. So I believe you can see there, friends, what we have. Very interesting that you have Orson Hyde's diary, but you also have a connection that they realize there's a connection between the Book of Mormon and Solomon Spaulding. And then what's interesting to me is the Cleveland Advertiser, which was February 15th, 1831. And then you got Bennett. He connects Sidney Rigdon and the Book of Mormon, August 7th, August 31st, September 1st, 1831. And then what's interesting to me is, 2 years later, we have Holbert taking down the statements, right? And some of the details that were given was they said, okay, I read Solomon Spaulding, or I read Solomon Spaulding's novel, but I don't recall, there was no religious part. There were no scriptures added to it. So who added it? Is there a connection? And I believe there is, friends. And the connection is that that Solomon Spaulding wrote the novel, but Sidney Rigdon had transformed it into the Book of Mormon, as we'll talk about later. So, we see the questions: who copied, stole this manuscript? Manuscript found. What happened to Spaulding's manuscript? Manuscript found. Is there a connection between Solomon Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon? That's what we need to search out, my friends. And we are getting closer to answering those questions. But we see there is a new question, right? Which was, is there a connection between Solomon Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon? Sorry. Now, interesting enough, like I said, we looked at Spaulding died in 1816, 14-year gap, 1830, the Book of Mormon is published, missionary activity takes place. In 1833, D.P. Holbert, he was an LDS convert who turned into an apostate, and he gathered the witness statements, and so the Spaulding witnesses that we saw was those 8 there. And then what we'll do, so before moving on, let's concern ourselves with the witness statements again. So I want to look at what Saints Unscripted said about this. So, I think they were wrong about Holbert being the originator of the Spaulding reigning theory, because you had 2 groups and you have to interconnect them. So I don't think that was, I don't think they were accurate. And I'm sure, I think they mean well. I really do. I think that ignorance is not about, ignorant means that you don't know the information. I think they might have been ignorant on this part. According to these affidavits, this is what they said in the video of their YouTube channel video. According to these affidavits, these people remember Solomon Spaulding reading part of a manuscript to them that contains names and details later found in the Book of Mormon. But as a summary of them, let's hear what the anti-Latter-day Saint author Fawn Brody said about them. So she wrote a book called No Man Knows My History, talking about Joseph Smith's history. And she says, it can clearly be seen that the affidavits were written by Holbert, since the style is the same throughout. It may be noted that although 5 out of the 8 had heard Spaulding's story only once, there was a surprising uniformity in the details they remembered after 22 years. Six recalled the names Nephi, Lamanite, etc. 6 held that the manuscript described the Indians as descendants of the lost 10 tribes. 4 mentioned that the Great Wars caused the erection of the Indian mounds, and 4 noted the ancient scriptural style. The very tightness with which Holbert here was implementing his theory rouses an immediate suspicion that he did a little judicious prompting. Now, what I'd like for you to do is go back to the other videos, read the statements of the witnesses, and see if did Fawn Brody accurately report what they actually said. I think that's important. Now, she says it can clearly be seen that the affidavits were written by Holbert since the style is the same throughout. It may be noted also that although 5 out of the 8 had heard Spaulding's story only, now notice this, only once, there was a surprising uniformity in the details they remembered after 22 years. Now, I think that's wrong that she said that, because John Spaulding says he then told me he'd been writing a book, which he intended to have printed, the avails of which he thought would enable him to pay all his debts. The book was entitled The Manuscript Found, of which he read to me many passages. So the assumption for John Spaulding's testimony that it would have taken more than once to have been read many passages, I think, is a reasonable assumption. Henry Lake says he very frequently read to me from a manuscript which he was writing. Notice that. He very frequently, which means more than once, which he entitled The Manuscript Found, which he represented as being found in this town. I spent many hours in hearing him read said writings and became well acquainted with its contents. John Miller. I was soon introduced to the manuscript of Spaulding, perused them as often as I had leisure. He had written 2 or 3 books or pamphlets on different subjects, but that which more particularly drew my attention was one which he called The Manuscript Found. Now notice this. From this, he would frequently read some humorous passages to the company present. And it seems like that was more than just only once, my friends. Oliver Smith. While engaged in business, he boarded at my house in all nearly 6 months. All his leisure hours were occupied in writing a historical novel, founded upon the first settlers of this country. During the time he was at my house, I read and heard read 100 pages or more. Now that sounds like more than once, but I discussed about him in a previous episode, and I encourage you to watch that again if you need to. Nahum Howard. He then told me he was writing a history of that race of people, and afterwards frequently showed me his writings, which I read. So very frequently, not just once. And then she makes this mistake, I believe. There was a surprising uniformity in the details they remembered. Now, it's true that some of them write down the same story, okay? All right. So, to me, what if you were told, for example, to write down the major plot line or the plot of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, to write down about Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and Return of the King? How would you summarize the whole plot line of that? All right, I'll give you time to think about it. Okay, and that's a big book. Those are 3 big books when you think about it. Here's what I would have said. I would have said it's about a young hobbit named Frodo Baggins who finds out through Gandalf that his uncle Bilbo Baggins had in his keeping for many years a master ring that was forged by the Dark Lord Sauron. Frodo must destroy the ring by taking it to Mount Doom in Mordor, where it must be cast to the fire from whence it came. Frodo the ring bearer sets out with other companions. That includes a wizard, 3 hobbits, a dwarf, an elf, and 2 men to complete this quest. Now, you would think probably your plot line is very similar to what I would have written, right? Because you talk about the same characters names, what the main storyline is. So I'm using an example there that yes, there is a uniformity, but at the same time, I think you can see that it is a case that we're going to see that some of them mention specific details that the others don't give, but that they are found in the Book of Mormon. Now, we will be adding the list of witnesses who testified after Holbert's 8 witnesses in 1833, And it's reasonable to me that a lot of these witnesses could give a generic storyline and the details associated with it, which will be uniform since the story does not change in its major plot points. Some of them remember details that the others did not provide, yet they help fit that jigsaw puzzle, friends. They fit the big picture. Now we will offer two examples. So here are some of the details, okay? 8 witnesses talk about the title, manuscript found. 12 witnesses say it was a historical novel. 6 witnesses say it's First Settlers of America. 5 witnesses say their descendants became the Native Americans. 8 witnesses say they journeyed from Jerusalem. 8 witnesses say Nephi and Lehi are the main characters. 6 witnesses talk about quarrels and contentions. 4 witnesses talk about 2 nations. They divide up into 2 nations. 6 witnesses talk about the bloody wars that ensued. 4 witnesses talk about the arts and sciences. 6 witnesses say that Spalding used and it came to pass a lot. And then 5 witnesses say there was no religious matter, scriptural quotations, or references, or heavy theological content. 10 witnesses would say, this is what those forts and mounds that have been discovered, this is where those civilizations came from. And these are the remains. Sorry. Then 5 witnesses talk about the obsolete style, the King James Version, how that kind of language is used. Now, here are the unique details here in the red. The judgments which they suppose were coming on the old world, which is Oliver Smith. The account of Laban, Henry Lake. Humorous passages, John and Miller. John and Miller mentions the character Moroni. John and Miller talks about that Solomon Spalding told they would land at the Straits of Darien. R.M.S. Cunningham talks about Nephi is mentioned frequently. Abner Jackson talks about the verbal alterations or additions. And then Joseph Miller talks about the red mark on the foreheads, which is found in Alma chapter 3. So Henry Lake, like we said, I think we already mentioned this, but he talks about the tragic account of Laban. Now, here's an interesting thing. I've already talked about this, but I want to mention one thing about this. Notice how Henry Lake, that this account is found in 1 Nephi 3-7. And it's interesting that Robert Patterson Jr., which was the son of the printer Robert Patterson of R&J Patterson, he was not an eyewitness, but he discovered concerning a tiny detail that was a grammatical mistake that Henry Lake had discovered, but also saw the same grammatical mistake many years later that ended up in the Book of Mormon, and that is 1 Nephi 3:28 and 29. He says also that an incongruity occurs in the story of Laban, where Nephi says they did speak many hard words unto us, their younger brothers, and they'd smite us with a rod, whereupon an angel appears and says, why do you smite your younger brother with a rod? Consistency would require the number, whether plural or singular, should be the same in both sentences. Why do you smite your younger brother, your brothers with a rod, right? The oversight is in itself a trifle, but its occurrence in both the Spalding manuscripts and the Book of Mormon is an unanswerable proof of identity. Or, why do you smite your younger brothers with a rod? And then I think about the Nephi statement that's made by R.M.S. Cunningham. And it's actually found 84 times. It's found 60 times in 1 Nephi alone. And there's all the mentions of it. And then 24 times it's found in 2 Nephi and 1 time in Helaman 9:36. So it can be easily seen why it would be the case that Cunningham, I remember this phrase since it occurred so frequently in 1st and 2nd Nephi. Okay? Then Fawn Brody says this. 6 recalled the names Nephi, Lamanite, etc. 6 held that the manuscript described the Indians as descendants of the lost 10 tribes. 4 mentioned that great wars caused the erection of the Indian mounds. 4 noted the ancient scriptural style. The very tightness with which Holbert was implementing his theory rouses an immediate suspicion They did little judicious prompting. John Miller has spoken of humorous passages in Spaulding's work, which would certainly apply to the manuscript story, but not to the early humorless Book of Mormon. Now, to me, of course, humor is very subjective. But, friends, I find it funny about the Jaredites building these barges as the length of a tree. Like, okay, which tree? Cedar? Spruce? What tree? Tightly unto a dish? I find that quite humorous. So they're plugging in the holes in and out on their journeys to the America. And then Shiz, he somehow struggles for breath after he's decapitated, and after 1529 through 31. And then, I'm not trying to be mean or anything, but Moroni, Moronaha. I mean, seriously, friends. I mean, you can't help but laugh at those. And then Von Burley says, other features like the scriptural style, the expression it came to pass, and the proffered name seem too definite to be questioned. Well, the scriptural style is a very important feature because it's not found in manuscript story. I mean, it's amazing to me how Book of Mormon has, and it came to pass so many times. Von Burley then says, but it should be remembered, as President Fairchild pointed out in his analysis of the problem, the Book of Mormon was freshened in their minds, and their recollections of the manuscript found were very remote and dim, that under the pressure and suggestion of Holbert and Howe, they should put the ideas at hand in place of those remote and forgotten, and imagine that they remembered what they had recently read would be only an ordinary example of the frailty of memory. It is significant that 5 of Holbert's witnesses were careful to accept the religious matter of the Book of Mormon as not contained in the Spaulding manuscript, and the others say that the historical parts were derived from the Spaulding story. The narrative Holbert found had no religious matter whatever, but the Book of Mormon was permeated with religious ideas. It was first and foremost a religious book. The theology could not have been wrought by interpolation, since practically every historical event was motivated either by Satan or the Lord. Now, we're going to show you where Rigdon could insert scriptural quotations, and that's what's being meant by the religious part. So, I think it's important to talk about what it means about religious matter. Now, it's true, manuscript story does even contains some Bible verses in it, but it doesn't compare to what the Book of Mormon has. In fact, if you get my free book, let me just show you something. Here you have the Bible quotations in the Book of Mormon, okay? You can see here, 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 here. That's all the scriptural quotations I was able to acquire and find in the Book of Mormon myself. And that others also had found too. So I think that's very important to talk about. Next time, we will start with our next part in just a few minutes. So please stick around with me. Very thankful for you for watching.